Garrick stood at the edge of the cliff, his rough hands gripping the worn wooden railing. The wind howled around him, carrying with it the scent of pine and the chill of the approaching winter. The mountains stretched endlessly before his eyes, peaks dipped in snow and valleys shadowed in gray. For years, he had called this wilderness his home. It was harsh, unforgiving, but it was his. Alone, he had learned to survive, to depend on no one but himself. Yet, even in the quiet grandeur of the mountains, a lonely ache tugged at his heart. The cabin behind him was small, built by his own hands. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, twisting into the pale sky like a signal of his solitary life. Inside, the hearth glowed, promising warmth, but the emptiness of the room pressed on him. Garrick had never been one for company. Friends came and went. Townspeople never lingered long in his life, and family had long been a memory. Life here was simple. Hunt, gather, build, and sleep. Yet, simplicity had its cost. Winter was fast approaching, and with it came the harsh reality of survival. The snow would fall heavily this year, heavier than the last. He could feel it in the air. Game would be scarce. Paths would be blocked. And the mountains, beautiful as they were, would turn into a white prison. He had food stored, but not enough to last the months ahead. Cooking for himself was tedious and monotonous, a task he handled only because he must. He needed someone who could help, someone who could bring warmth not just to the cabin, but to his life. The thought of hiring anyone made him uncomfortable. Garrick was used to solitude. People brought mess, complaints, and weaknesses. Yet, practicality outweighed pride. He needed help. And so, he had sent a letter to the nearby town, offering work to anyone willing to endure the cold and isolation in exchange for food, shelter, and coin. A few days later, a knock echoed on his door. Garrick's heart skipped slightly, a rare occurrence, and he opened the door to see her standing there. Alara. She was small and slight, her brown hair tucked under a simple cloth. A small bundle rested on her hip, the life of another depending on her strength. She was pregnant. He could see immediately. Though she carried herself with quiet dignity, her eyes, a deep green, met his without fear, though the trace of sorrow lingered in them. "Garrick?" she asked softly, her voice calm but strong. "You sent for me?" "Yes," he said simply, stepping aside. "Come in." His voice was gruff, his manners not refined, but it was honest. Alara entered, her boots leaving damp marks on the floor. She placed her bundle down and looked around, noting the cabin's simplicity. There were no frills, no comforts, just wood, stone, and the smell of smoke and pine. She nodded slightly, as if acknowledging that this would be a hard life, but one she was ready to face. "I can cook, clean, gather firewood," she said. "I can help you survive the winter." Garrick studied her carefully. She was fragile, her form delicate against the vastness of the cabin, yet there was a strength in the way she stood, in the way her eyes met his. Perhaps she would last, perhaps she would make the winter bearable. "You'll have work to do," he said, walking past her. "No complaints. You follow my rules, and you'll have food and shelter." "Don't," he stopped, realizing how harsh he sounded. "Don't expect more than that. This isn't a place for comfort." Alara smiled faintly. "I don't need comfort," she said. "Just a roof and some firewood, and I'll do my part." The days that followed were a mixture of tension and discovery. Garrick had never had someone in his life to cook for him. The smells of bread baking, stew simmering, and herbs boiling were foreign, yet comforting. The cabin, once cold and silent, now held warmth that was more than just fire. Alara worked quietly, efficiently. She moved through the space as if she had always belonged there, yet she never overstepped. Garrick found himself watching her more than he expected. The way she tended the fire, the careful way she prepared meals, the patience she showed when he struggled with a stubborn lock on a chest or a broken tool, it was all new to him. He was used to solving everything with his hands and strength. Yet here was someone who solved problems with quiet wisdom and care. One morning, after a particularly harsh night of wind and snow, Garrick awoke to the smell of something warm and rich. He followed it to the kitchen, where Alara was stirring a pot of stew, small pieces of bread cooling on the counter. She looked up and smiled. "Morning," she said simply. "Thought you might be hungry." Garrick grunted, the closest he could come to thanks. He sat down, the warmth of the food spreading through him. For the first time in years, he felt content. It was strange and almost uncomfortable. This feeling of comfort and care. Over the next few weeks, the two settled into a rhythm. Garrick hunted, gathered wood, and repaired the cabin. Alara cooked, cleaned, and tended the fire. Yet, it was more than work that filled the space between them. There were small conversations about the weather, the mountains, memories of the past. Alara spoke sparingly of her husband, of the life she had lost, and Garrick listened, learning about loss and resilience without realizing it. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Garrick found himself sitting outside, watching her light a lantern. The wind tugged at her cloak, yet she moved with calm, deliberate grace. He realized, with a weight he did not expect, that he had begun to rely on her presence, not for survival, but for something deeper. Companionship, perhaps. Understanding. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Alara said softly, noticing him watching. Garrick nodded, finding words unnecessary. For once, he did not need to speak. The mountain was still and silent, yet the cabin now held life. It was a life Garrick had never imagined he wanted, but could no longer ignore. And though he would not admit it aloud, he began to feel something unfamiliar. Hope. Hope that he could endure the winter not just with strength, but with someone beside him. Hope that the mountain, though harsh and unforgiving, could teach him more than survival. It could teach him trust, patience, and perhaps even something called grace. And so, the mountain man and the pregnant widow began a journey that neither fully understood yet. One built on necessity, yes, but also on discovery, courage, and the quiet promise that even in isolation, life had a way of surprising those who dared to open their hearts. The snow began to fall in soft, delicate flakes, covering the peaks and valleys in white. Inside the cabin, the hearth glowed, and Garrick, for the first time in many long years, felt a warmth that had nothing to do with fire. Alara hummed softly as she worked, her hands steady and sure. Garrick watched, a strange feeling in his chest, something like respect, admiration, and the faint stirrings of trust. The mountains were still wild, still dangerous, but for the first time, he did not face them alone. And that, he realized, was the most important thing of all. The snow fell thick and silent, blanketing the mountains in a soft, white layer. The world outside Garrick's cabin was cold and quiet. But inside, life stirred in ways he had not expected. Alara moved around the small kitchen with careful precision, stirring a pot of stew while humming a tune that was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. Garrick leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her work. He felt a strange mix of curiosity and caution. Her presence was comforting, yet unfamiliar. Garrick had spent years alone, relying on his own strength and skill. Now, every task he performed seemed small compared to the work Alara did. She could make a simple bowl of roots taste like a feast, keep the fire burning just right, and organize the cabin in a way that made it feel more like home than a shelter. He was not used to such care, and it unsettled him. "You're staring again," Alara said without looking up, her voice calm but amused. "I'm observing," Garrick muttered. He was not ready to admit that he was learning from her, that he respected her skill. Alara chuckled softly. "Observing, huh? That's a polite word for it, I suppose. But if you want to survive the winter, it would be better to help than watch." Her gentle tease struck a chord in him. He knew she was right. Pride had kept him alive in the mountains, but humility might now teach him to live better. He stepped forward, grabbing a broom to sweep the floor. The first days were filled with small clashes. Garrick wanted to hunt and cook in his own way, but Alara had her own methods. She organized supplies meticulously, rationed food, and planned meals ahead. Garrick often found himself frustrated, used to acting without thought. "This way is faster," he said once, gesturing to the pot she had just stirred. Alara shook her head, smiling faintly. "Faster isn't always better. It's the care you put in that lasts. Food, like life, needs patience." He grunted, not entirely understanding, but he noticed the stew tasted better than anything he had eaten in years. Their differences were not just in work. Garrick's ways were rough and practical. He valued efficiency and strength. Alara, however, valued patience and thoughtfulness. She taught him to gather herbs carefully rather than chopping quickly, to cook slowly rather than rushing, to listen to the mountains instead of just moving through them. One evening, a thick fog rolled in from the valley, surrounding the cabin like a soft, gray curtain. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending shivers through the room. Garrick, as usual, checked the perimeter, securing the cabin doors and making sure the firewood was stacked. Alara was inside, preparing a warm broth to sip after the work. "You could come in and warm yourself," she said, holding the bowl out to him. "I need to make sure we're safe," Garrick replied. Alara shook her head. "The storm isn't dangerous. The cabin is strong. You need to rest too, or you won't be able to help when it matters." Garrick paused. He had always believed that weakness was failure, that rest was a luxury. Yet, watching her serene composure, he began to see the truth in her words. She had lost much in her life, yet she carried herself with grace. Perhaps there was strength in calmness, in patience, in taking care of oneself and others. That night, the wind blew fiercely, but the cabin felt alive and safe. Alara hummed quietly as she worked, her presence filling the space with warmth. Garrick sat near the fire, watching the dancing flames, thinking about the lessons he was learning without realizing it. The next morning brought a new challenge. A heavy snowfall had blocked the usual path to the river, making water collection difficult. Garrick's first instinct was to clear it himself, to push through with brute strength. But Alara stopped him. "Wait," she said. "There's a safer way. We don't need to struggle blindly." She led him through a narrow side path she had noticed days earlier. One that wound carefully along the mountain, but avoided deep drifts and hidden ice. Garrick followed reluctantly, but by the time they reached the river, he was impressed. The route was safer, faster, and preserved their energy. "You think too much," he muttered, half annoyed, half amazed. Alara smiled. "Sometimes thinking is the strongest thing you can do." Garrick had never thought of intelligence and caution as strength before. In the mountains, it had always been about muscle and endurance. Now, he realized that survival was more than physical. It was mental, emotional, and even moral. As the days passed, small bonds formed between them. Garrick helped Alara with firewood and cabin repairs, while she taught him how to prepare herbs for tea, how to mend clothing, and how to cook food in a way that kept energy for long hours in the cold. The cabin, once cold and quiet, was filled with the sound of conversation, laughter, and even teasing. One afternoon, while Alara kneaded dough for bread, she spoke softly. "Do you ever regret being alone here?" Garrick paused, kneading a piece of wood for repairs. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's simple. I don't have anyone to argue with, no one to slow me down. But," he hesitated, unsure of his own thoughts, "it can be lonely." Alara nodded, understanding without judging. "Loneliness is heavy," she said, "but company doesn't have to be. It can be light, if you let it." Garrick didn't respond immediately, but her words lingered in his mind. He had always thought companionship was a burden, a distraction. Now, he began to see that it could be a source of strength, even joy. The most unexpected moment came one evening when Garrick was fixing the roof. He had leaned over the edge, hammer in hand, when he slipped slightly. Alara's voice called out immediately. "Be careful." He steadied himself, but the fear in her tone made his heart race. She rushed to him, steadying the ladder and checking his hands. "You must take care of yourself," she said, her voice soft but firm. Garrick realized something surprising. He wanted to protect her too. Not because it was necessary for survival, but because he cared. He had spent so long thinking only of himself. Yet now, there was someone else in the world whose safety mattered to him. Winter deepened, and the mountains became even more unforgiving. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Yet, with Alara by his side, Garrick discovered something he had not known. He wanted companionship, trust, and a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. One night, as the snow fell thickly outside, Alara hummed softly while preparing a simple stew. Garrick sat near the fire, watching her. He realized that he had begun to look forward to her presence, to the sound of her voice, to the calm confidence she carried. Her quiet grace was teaching him patience, care, and even hope. "Do you ever sing to the baby?" Garrick asked quietly, surprising even himself. Alara paused, smiling faintly. "Sometimes," she said. "It seems to calm them. And me." Garrick watched her work, her hands moving with delicate precision. There was strength in her gentleness, courage in her patience. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps life could be more than survival. Perhaps it could be shared. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. And in that home, two very different people were learning from each other. Garrick taught Alara how to survive in the mountains, how to read the weather, how to hunt and gather. Alara taught Garrick how to care, how to plan, how to slow down, and notice the beauty in the world around them. By the end of the second month, the bond between them was undeniable. Garrick had come to rely on her presence, her guidance, and her warmth. Alara had found a safe haven, a place where she could rest and prepare for the child she carried. Together, they faced the mountain, not as solitary beings, but as a team. And though neither would admit it aloud, both knew that their lives were changing. The harsh wilderness had brought them together, but it was their courage, patience, and grace that would allow them to thrive. The snow continued to fall outside, thick and silent. Inside, the cabin glowed with firelight. Garrick, for the first time in his life, did not feel the crushing weight of loneliness. He felt hope, and in that hope, the mountain seemed less wild, less lonely, and more alive than ever before. Winter had deepened in the mountains. Snow lay thick on the ground, covering the rocks and trees in a pure white blanket. The days were short, and the nights stretched long and cold. Inside the cabin, the fire's warmth fought against the chill, and the small space seemed cozier than ever. Garrick and Alara had settled into a steady rhythm. He hunted and chopped wood, while she cooked, tended the fire, and prepared their modest home for the months ahead. Yet, the mountains were never predictable. One afternoon, a heavy snowstorm swept down from the north, faster and fiercer than any winter they had faced before. The wind tore across the peaks, whistling and groaning like some wild creature. Trees bent under the weight of ice and snow. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the paths they used to fetch water or firewood were completely buried. Garrick stood at the cabin door, peering out into the whiteness. He felt the familiar tug of anxiety. Alone, he could have handled this in his own way. But now he had someone else to consider. He looked at Alara, who was carefully checking the firewood supply inside the cabin. Her brow furrowed in thought. "We'll be fine," she said calmly, noticing his hesitation. "The cabin is strong. We have food. And we have each other. That is enough," Garrick grunted. He wanted to believe her. Yet part of him felt the need to control the situation, to prepare for every possible danger. "We should double the firewood," he muttered. "Just in case." Alara nodded. "Good idea. I'll help." Together, they worked to stack more wood near the hearth. Alara moved quickly but carefully, showing an efficiency and grace that made Garrick pause. She didn't rush or panic. She assessed the storm and adjusted their preparations, as if she had done this many times before. Her calmness reminded him that sometimes, patience and careful thought were as powerful as strength and speed. As night fell, the snowstorm grew fiercer. The wind rattled the cabin walls, and icy flakes slapped against the windows. Garrick was used to storms. He had endured many, but there was something different this time. He was not alone. He had to care not only for himself but for Alara and the child she carried. The responsibility weighed heavily on him. And yet, for the first time, it did not feel like a burden. Alara brought him a warm cup of tea and sat beside him by the fire. "You can't control everything," she said gently, sensing his tension. "Some things are bigger than us, but we can face them together." Garrick stared into the flames, thinking of the many winters he had survived alone. He had relied on his skill, his strength, and his stubbornness. And yet, he had never felt the warmth he felt now, sitting beside someone who cared and trusted him. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The next morning, the storm had not fully passed. Snow still fell in soft sheets, covering the tracks they had left the day before. Water was low, and firewood was running short. They needed a plan. "We'll have to go out," Garrick said, putting on his thick coat and gloves. "We can dig a path to the river. It won't be easy, but it's the only way." Alara wrapped a scarf around her neck and nodded. "We can do it together. We just need to be careful." Stepping outside, the cold hit Garrick like a wall. Snow clung to his coat, and each step required effort. Alara followed, moving with careful balance, using a sturdy walking stick she had crafted from a branch. The wind bit at their faces, but they pressed on, relying on each other's strength and guidance. Halfway to the river, Garrick noticed that Alara was slowing slightly. He reached out, steadying her. "You need to rest," he said. "I'm fine," she replied, though he could see the strain in her eyes. "Not fine enough," he said firmly. "We'll take a short break here." They huddled under a large pine tree, shielded slightly from the wind. Alara drank some water, while Garrick checked the path ahead. He was impressed by her endurance. Despite her pregnancy and the cold, she moved with determination and steadiness that matched his own. It was in moments like this that he realized her strength was different from his. It was not measured by brute force, but by courage, patience, and resilience. After reaching the river and filling their containers, they began the long trek back. Snow had already begun to drift over the path they had cleared, making every step a challenge. Garrick fell once, but Alara was there immediately, steadying him and laughing softly. "Even the strongest stumble," she said. "It's how we rise that matters." Room 10. He looked at her, realizing that she had become more than a companion. She had become a teacher not just of survival, but of life. Her presence challenged him, inspired him, and softened the hard edges of his solitary existence. Back at the cabin, they carefully stored the water and tended the fire. Garrick felt a sense of pride, not for himself alone, but for the teamwork that had carried them through the storm. Alara prepared a hearty meal from their preserved food. The aroma filled the cabin, and Garrick felt warmth not just from the fire, but from the simple act of sharing a meal. That evening, they sat together, eating in companionable silence. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, there was peace. Garrick noticed how much he had come to depend on her presence, how her steady confidence had begun to shape his own. He wanted to protect her, to support her, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The following days brought more lessons. Alara showed him how to track the movement of wildlife beneath the snow, how to gather herbs that could be used to strengthen their immunity, and how to prepare simple remedies for minor injuries. Garrick, in turn, taught her the ways of the mountains, how to climb safely, how to hunt quietly, and how to read the clouds and winds for signs of weather. Together, they formed a partnership built on trust, respect, and shared experience. One evening, as they repaired a section of the cabin roof damaged by the storm, Garrick slipped slightly while hammering a plank. Alara caught his arm instinctively. "Careful," she said softly. "You can't help me if you're hurt." He looked at her, surprised by the tenderness in her voice. For years, he had been alone, and now someone was worried for him. Not because she needed something, but because she cared. It was a new feeling, one he had never expected. "Thank you," he said simply. She smiled. And in that moment, Garrick realized something important. Strength was not only in surviving the elements, but in surviving together, in caring for others, and in learning from them. Ilara had taught him patience, grace, and the quiet power of resilience. As the storm finally cleared, the mountains sparkled under a crisp, cold sun. Snow clung to every branch and rock, creating a world that was both beautiful and dangerous. Garrick and Ilara stood outside, surveying the landscape. "We made it," Garrick said, more to himself than to her. "Yes," she replied, her smile warm against the chill. "And we'll continue to make it, together." For the first time, Garrick felt a sense of hope that went beyond survival. He had endured the mountains alone for years, but now he realized that life was richer, fuller, and brighter when shared. Ilara had shown him that courage was not only about strength, but about patience, kindness, and grace. That night, as they sat by the fire, Garrick thought about the future. He no longer feared the long winter nights. He no longer felt the crushing weight of loneliness. With Ilara by his side, he knew they could face anything the mountains threw at them. And so, in the heart of the wilderness, two very different souls continued to grow together. The snowstorms, the cold, and the challenges of the mountains were no longer obstacles to bear alone. They were lessons to face together. A journey of trust, respect, and the quiet discovery of love and companionship. Garrick had learned something important. Survival was not the only measure of strength. Human resilience was also measured by the bonds we form, the care we give, and the courage to open our hearts to others. And in the quiet warmth of the cabin, with snow piled high outside, Garrick and Ilara began to understand that the greatest trials of the heart were not fought alone, but together. Winter had grown harsher in the mountains. The snow was deeper than before, covering the peaks and valleys in soft, blinding white. The wind howled constantly, rattling the cabin walls and forcing Garrick and Ilara to stay close to the fire. Yet, despite the bitter cold, the cabin had become a sanctuary, a place of warmth, care, and growing trust. Ilara moved carefully around the hearth, preparing another simple meal. Her hands were steady, though Garrick could see the subtle signs of fatigue in her posture. She had been through months of travel, work, and now her pregnancy had entered a critical stage. The baby's movements were gentle yet persistent, a constant reminder of the new life growing inside her. Garrick noticed her pause occasionally, her hand on her stomach, listening to the rhythm of the tiny heart inside. He had never thought much about babies before. In his solitary life, the thought of children had seemed distant, almost abstract. But now, watching Ilara, he felt a strange stirring of protectiveness, something deeper than duty and instinct he hadn't realized he possessed. "You need to rest," he said one morning, breaking the silence as he carried a bundle of firewood inside. Ilara shook her head, smiling faintly. "I'm fine. Just finishing the bread." Garrick frowned. "You're not fine. You're carrying a life inside you. You need care, not more work." She looked at him, eyes soft but firm. "I've managed so far. I can manage a little more." He set the wood down and crossed his arms, refusing to argue further. She was stubborn, just like him. Yet, in her stubbornness, there was also a strength he admired. He realized that she was not weak, she was courageous in ways he had never understood. A week later, the storm arrived. This one was unlike any they had faced before. Snow fell in thick sheets, and the wind whipped violently, making the mountains seem alive with fury. Visibility was near zero, and the cabin seemed almost tiny against the vastness of the white world outside. Garrick went outside to check the doors and windows, ensuring that they were secure. Ilara followed him, carrying a small bundle of supplies. She moved carefully, each step measured against the deep snow. "This one is worse than the last," Garrick said, scanning the horizon. "Yes," she replied calmly. "But we have each other, and we are prepared." That is what matters. For the next few days, they were confined to the cabin. Food and water were limited, and the constant cold weighed heavily on their bodies. Garrick noticed Alara's strength more than ever. She moved gracefully, prepared meals efficiently, and cared for the fire and the cabin without complaint. Her presence had become a steadying force for him, a reminder that survival was more than brute strength. It was patience, care, and resourcefulness. Then, one night, everything changed. Alara awoke in the middle of the night, clutching her stomach. Pain had arrived suddenly, sharper than she expected. She gasped, unsure of what was happening, and then realized it was time. The baby was coming early. Garrick awoke immediately at the sound of her voice, alarmed. "Alara?" he asked, rushing to her side. I think it's time," she said between breaths. Garrick's heart pounded. He had never faced a moment like this, not in all his years of hunting, chopping wood, or surviving storms. This was beyond anything he had prepared for. But there was no hesitation. He realized that he could not rely on strength alone. He had to be present, attentive, and calm. "Okay," he said firmly. "We can do this. I'll help you. Follow my lead, and we'll get through it." Alara nodded, her hand on his arm. "I trust you." The hours that followed tested Garrick in ways he had never imagined. He gathered blankets, warmed water, and kept the fire steady. He spoke softly to Alara, offering encouragement and comfort. Every time she winced or moaned in pain, he steadied her hand, whispered calm words, and reminded her of the life they were bringing into the world together. Alara, in turn, displayed courage that amazed him. She endured the pain with quiet determination, never letting fear dominate her. Her strength was not in muscle, but in patience, endurance, and trust. She had taught him so much already, and now, in this critical moment, she was teaching him the ultimate lesson: grace under pressure. The night stretched on, each hour feeling longer than the last. Garrick followed Alara's guidance, fetching supplies, adjusting the fire, and maintaining a calm presence. He marveled at her ability to remain composed, even as pain and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. He realized that courage was not the absence of fear, it was action in spite of it. Finally, in the early hours of morning, the baby arrived. A small, healthy cry filled the cabin, echoing against the wooden walls. Garrick's heart swelled in a way he could not describe. He looked at Alara, exhausted but smiling, and then at the tiny life they had brought into the world together. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it," she corrected softly, a tired but proud smile on her face. The first moments with the baby were quiet and tender. Garrick held the child gently, marveling at the smallness and fragility of new life. He felt a sense of awe he had never experienced before. This was not just survival, it was creation, care, and connection. He understood, perhaps for the first time, the true meaning of responsibility and love. Over the following days, as the storm continued outside, Garrick and Alara settled into their new roles. He fetched water, chopped wood, and helped with meals, while she tended to the baby and rested. The cabin, once a place of survival and isolation, had become a home filled with life, laughter, and quiet joy. Garrick discovered new depths to his own character. He was still strong, still capable of enduring the mountains, but he had learned that true strength also included patience, empathy, and the willingness to care for others. Alara had opened his eyes to these truths, and now he lived them every moment. One morning, as the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the snow, Garrick and Alara stepped outside with the baby swaddled in a warm blanket. The mountains stretched endlessly around them, cold and wild, yet beautiful. "We made it," Garrick said quietly, glancing down at the child. "Yes," Alara replied, her eyes shining. "And we will continue to make it, together." Garrick realized that the mountains, once a symbol of isolation and struggle, had become a place of growth, love, and new beginnings. The storms, the cold, and the hardships had not defeated them, they had strengthened them, taught them courage, and deepened their bond. As they returned to the cabin, Garrick felt a sense of peace he had never known. He looked at Alara, tired but radiant, and knew that he had gained more than a companion. He had gained a partner, a teacher, and a family. The storm outside gradually subsided, leaving the world glistening in white. Inside, the fire burned steadily, casting warmth over the cabin. Garrick held the baby in his arms while Alara prepared a simple breakfast. They worked together seamlessly, their movements synchronized by months of shared experience and trust. For the first time, Garrick understood that survival was not the only measure of strength. True resilience lay in care, connection, and the courage to open one's heart. The mountains had tested them, but they had endured not just because of skill and strength, but because of love, trust, and the quiet grace that Alara had brought into his life. And as the sun rose over the snow-covered peaks, Garrick knew that this was only the beginning. The mountains would continue to challenge them, but together, they could face anything. The baby, sleeping peacefully in his arms, was a reminder of the future, a future built on courage, care, and the enduring strength of the human heart. In that moment, Garrick understood something he had never known before. That true victory was not in conquering the mountains, but in finding grace, love, and purpose amidst the cold and the storms. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains. The snow that had covered the peaks and valleys for months began to melt, revealing patches of green grass, wildflowers, and rushing streams. The world seemed to awaken, carrying with it a sense of new beginnings. Inside the cabin, life had changed as well. Garrick, Alara, and their newborn child had settled into a rhythm that was both comforting and full of energy. The cabin, once a small shelter for a solitary man, now radiated warmth and life. Laundry hung on lines near the fire. Dishes were stacked neatly, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh bread and herbs. Garrick found himself marveling at how different his life had become. He had survived years in the mountains alone, relying only on his strength, skill, and stubbornness. But now, he had something more. He had family, companionship, and a sense of purpose that went far beyond mere survival. Alara sat by the hearth, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. She hummed a soft tune, a melody that had become familiar and comforting over the past months. Garrick watched her quietly, noticing the gentleness in her eyes and the care in her movements. She had taught him more than he could have imagined. She had taught him patience, grace, and the quiet power of kindness. "You're staring again," Alara said, smiling faintly. Garrick grunted, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'm thinking." "About what?" she asked, tilting her head curiously. "About everything," he replied simply. "About how different life feels now. About how much I've learned from you." Alara laughed softly, a sound that warmed the cabin more than the fire ever could. "You've learned more than you think," she said. "You've learned to care, to notice, and to share. That's stronger than anything you could do alone." Garrick nodded, understanding her words more deeply than he had expected. He had faced storms, harsh winters, and the loneliness of the mountains, but nothing had challenged him like opening his heart. The baby, nestled in Alara's arms, cooed softly, as if confirming her words. Over the following weeks, life in the cabin settled into a rhythm that balanced work, care, and small joys. Garrick taught Alara how to navigate the newly revealed mountain trails, how to identify edible plants, and how to store food for long periods. She, in turn, taught him how to cook with creativity, how to care for the baby, and how to plan for the future with patience and thoughtfulness. One afternoon, Garrick decided to take a walk down to the valley. He wanted to check the streams, gather fresh water, and hunt a few small animals to supplement their food. He bundled the baby carefully in a warm blanket and carried him to Alara's side. "I want to help," he said, looking into her eyes. Alara shook her head gently. "No, you need to rest. Let me carry him this time. You have done enough today." Garrick hesitated, but he trusted her judgment. She was not just a partner in survival, she was a guide, a teacher, and a source of calm he had never known. Watching her walk steadily with the baby, he realized how far they had both come. The mountains that once symbolized isolation now symbolized life, growth, and the possibility of happiness. As the days grew warmer, Garrick noticed small signs of life returning to the land. Birds sang in the trees, wildflowers peeked through the melting snow, and the streams gurgled with fresh water. He felt a renewed energy and purpose. For years, the mountains had been a test of endurance and skill, but now they were a classroom for learning about resilience, patience, and connection. One morning, Garrick and Alara decided to take the baby to a small meadow near the cabin. The sun shone brightly, and the fresh grass felt soft under their feet. They laid down a blanket, and Garrick watched as the baby's tiny hands reached toward the sky. Alara smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Look at him," she said softly. "All of this. It's a new beginning." Garrick nodded. "Yes. And it's ours." Together, they spent hours in the meadow, exploring the edges of the forest, observing the birds, and listening to the gentle rush of a nearby stream. Garrick found himself teaching the baby the ways of the mountains, in small ways pointing out a squirrel, showing how the wind bent the trees, and explaining the sounds of nature. Alara taught the baby about gentleness, kindness, and curiosity. Together, they were shaping a child who would grow up with courage, intelligence, and heart. Back at the cabin, life continued with small, meaningful tasks. The fire needed tending, the woodpile needed replenishing, and the garden Alara had started was beginning to grow. The cabin was no longer a mere shelter, it was a home. Each day, Garrick felt more connected to life, to the people he cared about, and to the land that had once been indifferent to him. One evening, Garrick sat outside, watching the sun set over the mountains. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the snow that remained glistened in the fading light. Alara joined him, carrying the baby in her arms. They sat together on a large rock, enjoying the quiet beauty of the world. "I never thought I'd see a sunset like this," Garrick said quietly. "Not like this. Not with this kind of peace." Alara rested her head against his shoulder. "Peace comes from more than the mountains," she said softly. "It comes from love, care, and trust. We've learned that, haven't we?" Garrick nodded, feeling the truth of her words deep in his chest. The mountains had taught him endurance and strength, but Alara had taught him something even more important: grace. Grace in work, grace in patience, and grace in caring for others. As the weeks passed, the family continued to thrive. The baby grew stronger, learning to roll over and eventually crawl. Garrick and Alara worked together seamlessly, anticipating each other's needs and supporting each other through daily tasks. Their partnership was no longer about necessity, it was about respect, trust, and love. One afternoon, Garrick found a small wildflower patch near the cabin and decided to gather some flowers for Alara. He carefully picked a handful of bright blooms and brought them inside. "For you," he said, holding out the small bouquet. Alara smiled, taking the flowers and placing them in a simple vase on the table. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's beautiful." Garrick realized that small gestures mattered as much as survival skills. Life was no longer only about enduring hardship, it was about creating beauty, nurturing growth, and sharing joy. The mountains remained vast and wild, but Garrick no longer feared them. He had learned that true strength was not in conquering nature alone, but in forming bonds, caring for others, and embracing the lessons that life offered. The storms, the cold, and the challenges had shaped him, but it was love and grace that had truly transformed him. Spring fully arrived, and with it came the first signs of abundance. Wild berries ripened, streams swelled with fresh water, and the sun grew warm and welcoming. Garrick, Alara, and their child walked together through the mountains, exploring the land that had once been a place of solitude but now felt alive with possibility. One morning, Garrick sat by the stream, watching the water rush over smooth stones. He picked up a small pebble and tossed it into the current. Watching the ripples spread, Alara knelt beside him, the baby giggling in her arms. "It's beautiful here," she said, her voice soft. "Yes," Garrick agreed. And it's more than just the mountains. It's us, together. Ilara smiled, brushing her hand across his arm. Yes, together. That's what makes it beautiful. In the months that followed, the family grew stronger and more connected. Garrick taught the child the ways of the mountains, the paths to climb, the streams to follow, and the signs of weather. Ilara taught the child about patience, kindness, and curiosity. Together, they were shaping a new life. One built on courage, love, and understanding. As the sun set on another day, Garrick and Ilara stood outside, watching the sky turn pink and gold. The baby slept peacefully in Ilara's arms. Garrick took a deep breath, feeling the crisp mountain air fill his lungs. He thought about all the storms they had endured, all the lessons they had learned, and all the growth that had taken place in such a short time. The mountains were still wild, still unpredictable, but Garrick no longer feared them. He had faced the harshest winters, survived storms, and endured hardships beyond measure. And yet, it was the lessons of grace, care, and love that had made the biggest difference. Garrick smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He looked at Ilara, then at the baby, and finally at the mountains stretching endlessly before them. "This is home," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "This is life, together." Ilara rested her head on his shoulder, and for a moment, the three of them, man, woman, and child, stood in quiet harmony. The mountains, once symbols of isolation and struggle, had become a place of growth, hope, and endless possibility. And in that moment, Garrick understood something he had never known before. True strength was not in surviving alone, but in living fully, caring deeply, and embracing life with grace. The sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the snow-melted valleys. Birds sang their evening songs, and the streams glimmered in the fading light. The cabin glowed warmly, a beacon of life in the vast wilderness. For Garrick, Ilara, and their child, the mountains were no longer a challenge to endure. They were a home to nurture, a classroom for learning, and a world full of wonder. Together, they had survived, learned, and grown. Together, they would face whatever the future held. And so, the mountain man, the pregnant widow who had become his partner, and their child, began a new chapter. A chapter filled with hope, resilience, and the quiet, enduring power of human grace. The mountains had taught them much, but it was the lessons of the heart, the courage to love, the patience to care, and the willingness to grow together that would guide them forever.